Good evening, everyone. Members of council, are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest or general nature thereof? I see none. So we'll move on to the approval of council minutes. Looking for a mover and seconder to receive the council minutes of June 12th. Councillor Verbicki, Councillor Wilkinson. Discussion on that motion. All in favor? Carried. And also looking for a mover and seconder for the council meeting held June 12th, special one. Sorry, Councillor Hammond and Councillor Dunn. Discussion on the motion. All in favor? And carried. Is there any business arising out of those minutes? Not now. Yes, okay. Then we'll move on. Before we get into it all, though, we have a really heavy agenda here this evening. So I feel pretty secure that council's read all the reports that have been here. So if you don't mind, I'll give administration direction to just hit the highlights of your reports. Just make sure that we're aware of the most important things and see if we can't move through fairly quickly. First thing, we start off as a public meeting, including the addendum that was attached later today, and I believe Ms. Truax is taking us through this meeting regarding the public meeting to zone 530 Highway 77.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson, members of council. This is the public meeting for consideration of a zoning bylaw amendment. It is to change the zoning of the property located at 530 Highway 77 from A5 to C4, and that will allow for the expansion of the existing trucking operation at 538 Highway 77. So council may recall in 2015, you did deal with a site plan for the expansion to the service building for the trucking operation at 538 Highway 77. The owner was looking to construct a 1,500 square foot building addition, as well as do some general improvements to that property. After discussion, council approved the site plan with direction that some fencing that's required along the rear yards of the residential lots fronting on Highway 77, that it be installed within 1 year, that the owner continue to work with MTO to get the necessary approvals, and that the owner continue to work with administration to satisfy the hard surfacing requirements for that property. So since that time, the owner has continued to work with us. They've continued to work with MTO. They have now acquired 530. So that's the hatched property showing on the key map. And they do intend to expand the trucking operation onto that piece of property. That would include 16 additional truck trailer parking spots, as well as the conversion of that existing dwelling to a house. Together, these properties are just over 5 acres in area. They have 237 feet of frontage along Highway 77, and it's about a 25% increase in the overall operation. So the zoning amendment is required to change 530 from A5 to C4. So the existing trucking operation is already in the C4 zone. The C4 zone permits the truck depots, and along with truck depots, you have the truck services and the dispatch offices. So they're all permitted uses. This is what we expect to see in this area. With this application, we've received a planning justification report prepared by Jackie Lassaline, the consultant for the owner. We have a stormwater management report that deals with both of the properties, 538 and 530. We have a formalized mutual drainage agreement with Highline Produce, and we have an updated site plan that was prepared by Baird AE. So with the mayor's direction, and I can say that the proposed zoning, it is consistent with the PPS as well as the county official plan. So we're dealing with a secondary settlement area that's to be used for employment uses and developed in accordance with the policies of our local OP. So we are doing that. We're consistent with those documents. Within the local OP, this property, as well as much of the area in many of the properties in the surrounding area, it is designated as Highway 77 Corridor Commercial District. This area is to be used for light industrial as well as highway commercial type uses. And the existing A5 zoning was really just to recognize that we did have residential uses in that property or in that area. All of those A5 uses are considered legal non-conforming, so over time, the long-term plan is that those uses would be phased out and the industrial and highway commercial type uses would be brought into this area. So again, we're looking to change the zoning on 530 from A5 to C4. This will also, once these properties are developed as a consolidated piece of property, it's going to correct a number of deficiencies that are currently present on just 538. So when you were presented with the site plan last time, this property had about 4% landscaped open space, and it maintained that. Now with the consolidation and the new revised site plan, they do comply with 30% landscaped open space, so definitely an improvement. We do note that the location of the dwelling, 530 Highway 77, it would become non-complying, but it's deemed to be appropriate for use as an office, maybe more so than a house. We do note that under the C4, we don't regulate where the parking areas are, so we don't have provisions for that within the zoning. So therefore, we turn to site plan control to address any impacts from that use. This public meeting is a really good opportunity to hear from neighbors with respect to that development of that property and look to see what we can address through the site plan agreement. So with that in mind, the applicant has brought forward a revised site plan, which includes the requirements that council directed be a part of the site plan from 2015, so that's the fencing. It also incorporates how 530 Highway 77 will be used, and it also proposes surface treatments for the traveled areas within the property. And I think that was one of the main issues the last time the site plan was brought forward for council, was to determine what's the appropriate, what is to the satisfaction of the municipality when it comes to hard surfacing. So the site plan now shows that the entire entrance of the property, which is greater than the length of a standard transport truck, it will be hard surface, so that is considered hard surfacing. The applicant has proposed that the main access way up to the existing service building, as well as the, I'll call it employee parking or long-term domestic vehicle where we'd see trucks and cars parked, that would be a tar and chip surface, and that there would be the placement of clear stone aggregate in those areas where the trailers are going to be backed in and parked on. Again, we've confirmed with engineering services that only asphalt is what would be considered hard surfacing. The site plan also includes improvements to the areas, so the site plan as proposed, it's showing upgrades for the septic systems that are there now, so they're going to be able to bring those septic systems into compliance. I've noted that there's additional green space. I think most importantly is that they are going to provide green space along the frontage of Highway 77 to where the existing houses align with that. Big improvement for the aesthetics along Highway 77 as well as those houses that are fronting on Highway 77. There's also a requirement for parking stops, so to ensure that truck trailers don't encroach or go over into the grassed areas. The site plan also incorporates a 10-foot buffer area and setback from the property lines, as well as additional plantings along the southern property line, so the new property. It was also brought to our attention while we were reviewing this new site plan that in 2008, there is a site plan registered on title that was approved by council again in 2008, and that allowed all of 538 to be developed as a graveled parking area. So that was approved by council at that time. So the site plan before us now, as well as the request that was made in 2015, they're really opportunities to establish or to improve the standard of development that is expected for the properties along the Highway 77 corridor commercial district. The zoning bylaw does not establish what that standard is beyond the satisfaction of the municipality, and that it can be determined through site plan control. However, we do note that the property standards bylaw does require that all non-residential uses which abut residential properties must be asphalt or a similar surface. The owner has attempted to address the possibility of creating dust by proposing to surface the main traveled areas with asphalt and tar and chip surfaces, and to include provisions within the site plan agreement to maintain those areas which are proposed to be graveled or to be include the clear stone aggregate. I do want to note that comments were received by an abutting property owner at 540 Highway 77. Council has been provided with that correspondence. I had an opportunity to meet with that owner this morning, who took the time to review the site plan as it's proposed. In doing that, the owner did bring forward a further request to be provided with additional fencing and landscaping along the property line with 540. So they looked at what was proposed along the southern property boundary for 530 and said, can we do that along our property as well? So that would help address many of their concerns. They also noted that the nuisance of noise generated from from trucks parking, idling, and running refrigeration units in the area that is shown for, again, employee or domestic vehicle parking, which is right along the southern property line of their property. That needs to be addressed immediately. So we've got trucks parking in areas where on the site plan they've indicated that's where employees should be parking. They also requested that, just like the fencing that was to be required along the rear of the residential lots within 1 year's time, they've asked that the security fencing that was originally proposed to be installed within 3 years' time, so it's not a requirement of the municipality, it was chain link fencing to go around the entire site, and I think it was the applicant at the time saw that they would be putting that in within 3 years' time. They're requesting or stating that there's a need for that security gate and fence to be installed immediately, as they feel that it'll address many of the instances where people are just pulling into the property and just parking, not parking in assigned parking spaces, that type of thing. And they were also, we discussed how site plan is implemented and how the timelines in site plans are implemented by the municipality. So how do we make sure that the landscaping goes in? So we had that discussion today. Comments were also received this afternoon from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs. They noted that there were no concerns from the Ministry of Transportation with respect to the use of the property, in particular the change of use for 530, and that MTO will continue to work with the owner in the review of the site plan. So the purpose this evening is to hear from the applicant as well as any public in attendance with respect to the proposed expansion of the existing trucking use onto 530 Highway 77, as well as to seek comments which may make improvements to the current site through site plan control. Pending further comments from council and anyone in attendance, administration is in a position to support the requested zoning amendment and the development of the property subject to the provisions of site plan control. I just wanted to take a moment to let anyone know that was in attendance to speak to this evening that there is a public sign-in sheet at the rear of the rear entrance, and that if they wanted to sign in, we will attempt to send them, or we will send them a notice of decision of this meeting.
Thank you very much. So, being a public meeting, do we have questions before I go to Deputy Mayor?
Just a couple for clarification, if I could, Danielle. So that private fencing that we asked for back in 2015, was that put in at the rear of the?
It has not been installed to date. So I think to clarify that, so the site plan was approved with a timeline provided they meet all of the other provisions. They haven't met the provisions, so really it hasn't been approved. We haven't entered into an agreement with them because we've still been negotiating the hard surfacing. They're still working with MTO to obtain their final approvals. Now, keep in mind that they've now added another property, and that sort of put them at the beginning of the process with MTO again. MTO and stormwater management. So again, they've added another property into their stormwater management and had to start that review all over again. So 2015, approval subject to meeting all these things. We've been working with them to meet them, and then we've just recently, 2016, changed it by adding in another property, and so that's where we are.
But we gave them a year and they didn't get it done. We have faith that it's going to happen within the timelines that we're proposing again.
The approval, subject to approval of the site plan agreement. We never entered into a site plan agreement. We couldn't get all of the other issues satisfied.
Okay, then further to that, 2008, we had a council agreement that they could leave it all gravel, and we didn't know that in 2015.
Okay. Any other questions? Then, Councillor?
Danielle, can I just get a little bit of confirmation from you? I see the letter from the Fittlers was dated on June 22nd, but you say you met with them this morning. It sounds like they've, since then, after you've spoken with them, they are lessening their stance in some regards here to this, as long as the property owner will, like you say, put in trees along the south line, security fencing, or sorry, security gates, but they have somewhat lessened their stance. Am I correct in that opinion?
In speaking to Mrs. Fittler this morning, so I'm not going to answer that, but I'm just going to say that they do acknowledge that this is a permitted use. They recognize that this is something that's permitted in this area. And in reviewing it, I did get the impression that if we were able to implement a number of these things that would help to control the operation, that would help.
Okay, no other questions from council, then being a public meeting. Anyone that's in the audience to address council on this item, I invite you to come forward, turn the microphone on, introduce yourself, and address council.
Good evening, Your Worship and Council. My name is Jackie Lassaline. I'm here representing the applicants as their planning consultant. Marnie Setterington is here as their solicitor. Just for a point of clarity, in 2015, we had the issue regarding the gravel parking lot, and with that issue, we've been negotiating it, and we've now come up to the resolution that we have before you today. Because of it, the agreement hasn't been signed and registered. With that, the time frame identified in the agreement hasn't been started, and will begin. To a certain extent, our client has been holding back because of the site plan agreement. You don't want to do anything until you have that approval. So, I'll take you quickly through my presentation tonight. So the zoning bylaw amendment is basically, there are two issues that we're dealing with. One is the zoning bylaw amendment to deal with 530 Highway 77, and that's because of the merger of these lands with 538. The zoning bylaw will change 530 portion of the lands to the C4 zoning, bringing that property into conformity with the official plan and the use into conformity with the official plan. Presently, the property is designated in the official plan as a highway commercial land use. The residential wasn't seen as a use for that property, and eventually, according to the official plan, that whole Highway 77 section is to eventually become a highway commercial district. So, the zoning tonight being requested is for 530 to bring that property into compliance to see it as a C4 zoning. So the site plan control. As we discussed, there have been many discussions about the site plan. We've had many issues that we've addressed and we've come to conclusion with. Originally, the site plan was approved in 2008, showing the parking lot as gravel. That is still in force and effect. What's being asked for tonight is approval of an amendment to that existing registered agreement. The proposed amendment will improve on that substantially. The MTO has provided a verbal approval, and we've addressed their concerns and their entrance issues. At the heart of the request for the amendment to the site plan is an addition to the service bay of the property of 487 square meters. Now, with 430 Highway 77, as part of the ownership, that property has rolled into the site plan and will be included in the site plan amendment to be registered on title. The new site plan mitigates extensive issues with landscaping. There's a substantial amount of green space that's been added. This will help with both the amenity, the view from Highway 77, but also mitigate the existing residential land uses. As you can see along the one side where there's an existing residence, there's going to be a fence and a row of trees. As Danielle indicated, the Fittlers have asked for trees as well along their fence line, which of course can be accommodated. There's also been the issue of setbacks that have been provided, bumper stops for the trucks, bumper stops for the vehicles. These will provide for the maintenance of the greenscape. business practices are being implemented with the site plan as well. And these business practices include such issues as allowing for the reefer trucks to be parked at the far back area of the property to avoid the residential use. This will go a long way, I think, in helping the Fittlers' concern regarding the noise. Gate and security will be installed to MTO specifications at the front of the property along Highway 77. Dust measures will be incorporated into the agreement. The existing registered agreement does allow for gravel, as Danielle indicated. The applicant, to mitigate some of the traffic issues and the dust issues, there'll be a combination of clear aggregate, which is a stone that does not create dust, will be spread throughout most of the property. Tar and chip will be included, and recycled asphalt will be provided at the back. Being in the rural area, it is very cost prohibitive to allow for 5 acres to be paved. A quote that was undertaken of a local firm came out at approximately $575,000. Also, existing local municipalities, both Essex and Kingsville, allow for the rural area and recognize the development of those rural lots with dust, but with dust suppressants. So wording can be incorporated into the agreement. The applicant has taken very extensive, expensive maneuvers and measures to minimize the dust, but should there be any dust, that dust suppressant can be added. Other local municipalities do it, and it is a standard policy and procedure. Also, this area has been designated for highway commercial and for uses exactly as a truck depot. This is a permitted use and should be seen as a permitted use and should be supported and encouraged to create a positive development of their property. So, as a professional question, is it sound planning? Absolutely. The site plan control will bring measures forward that will improve the site and will allow them to develop their property appropriately. There will be substantial buffering, landscaping, and noise measures. There is also wording that can be included in the agreement to deal with the dust. The site is an excellent location and has to be regarded that this is a use that is supporting one of your major industries in town. As a transportation truck depot, it is a needed use for your greenhouses and for your industries in town. There will be mature landscaping provided on site, and as I said, it's critical to support your local businesses. So in conclusion, in my professional planning opinion, the requested zoning bylaw amendment and site plan is consistent with the PPS, conforms with the official plan, complies with comprehensive zoning bylaw, and makes sound planning.
Thank you very much. Questions from council? Councillor Verbicki?
Through the mayor, if the letter we received, if the applicant kind of agrees with what's going to be done, what I just heard, and they're happy with what's going to be done, you know, I can't see much change that we can't do this, and I don't even want to think about legalities afterwards. But I can see it working. So that's at time B, we'll do something about it.
Councillor Jacobs?
Thank you, Worship. I guess my question will go back to site plan control. When, as we said before, some of the, I guess, agreements when you were previously here with the fencing and so forth, but you didn't have the site plan, wasn't completed at that specific time. Now, if we pass this and your site plan control, what measures do you have to ensure that these recommendations or agreements will be taken care of? And I look back too, as we had a previous situation in town here, which still exists with a truck depot, with the amount of dust and so forth that's created at that particular, and there seems to be no resolution no matter how hard we try. And I guess just rather than duplicate that type of situation, what can we do to protect that?
So I think I'll speak to the two matters separately. So the measures to make sure that it gets done. So what we do is we require the owner to include such things as the cost of the fencing and the landscaping, the planting of trees to be included as part of their security. So we hold that until it's completed to ensure that it is completed. We put timelines within the agreement so that they're required to put them in within that time. Essentially, as part of that, they have to finish that work. So we would have to enforce to ensure that that's done. So that'd be the first part, is following up, making sure that it's done. The second one with respect to dust. So I know that Legal and Legislative Services as well as Council have been dealing with another location that has generated a lot of dust. I don't believe that this type of operation, that we would ever be able to put any measures in that would say we will never generate any dust. And so I think it's expected that it will, that we've put in some measures to mitigate the impacts on the surrounding. We are putting in provisions within the agreement that would require them to take action. Again, that would mean we're going to get a complaint about dust. We would have to notify the owner that we've received it, and they would have to take action. All of that requires, in the end, we would have to enforce that under the provisions of the site plan. So it's that long legal process then saying you didn't follow what we told you to do. So we do have measures to make sure that they put those things in, and then as a follow-up, the second part, what happens when it does get dusty, that's where I think we're acknowledging that this type of operation, it will create dust. I think even as Ms. Lasseline had spoken to, if it was completely hard surfaced, I believe that we're still likely to get dust complaints. It's just less likely to happen. And then what the tools we would have to enforce that would be through legal ways, through the site plan control.
Deputy Mayor?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Jackie, I appreciate your comments. None of us are in the business of wanting to put other people out of business, and a cost prohibitive hard surfacing is something that we struggled with when this came to us in 2015. My problem was just with the fence, because to me, I thought that was a relatively easy thing to do. So that's the reason for one eyebrow being raised. We're entering into another process looking for more when way back, and I realize the site plan wasn't put forward, but I have my doubts. So that's my reason for the questions, and I sincerely hope that when we get to the end of this process, all of these things will be done. I'm just a little bit skeptical, I guess is the best word. That's all I'm saying. I don't want this business not to prosper. We don't want to put anybody in handcuffs, but we also have responsibility to the neighbors, to surrounding properties, and that was my concern here.
Your worship, may I speak to that just briefly?
Yes.
We were not given the authorization under the site plan. We were not entering into an agreement to undertake that. We were not in a position to put the fencing up. Once the agreement is authorized by both parties and registered on title, our client will be implementing all the different features that we've talked about tonight. But we weren't given that authorization. And that's why we're asking council to authorize the site plan amendment so we can do that, so that we can get the fencing in, so we can get the landscaping in, and we can get everything tidied up.
Deputy Mayor?
Well, we'll hold you to that then. Thank you.
Councillor?
Through the mayor, I'd like to move the recommendation from administration, the 4 bullet points.
And before you make that motion, though, Councillor, can I go back to the public? Because I don't know if everybody's had an opportunity to address council on this yet. Thank you. Is there any, did you have, okay. I'll let you introduce yourself.
My name is Ed Bartel. I'm a shop supervisor and manager of Highway 77 truck repair. I've been with Ben Peters for 3 years, sorry. I sort of stepped into, I know there was action on the properties before because he had purchased neighboring properties. This was word of mouth from him to allow him to have a proper entrance for semi-trucks to come in off the highway. There's a few things here, a few points that I wanted to go through. Number one, it seems like, maybe not himself, but in the past, there's been some dander raised over the way things were done there. I wasn't witness to that. I don't know whether the rules were all followed or not. I do know that we are now coming in year number 3, and originally we started only with trying to put a small expansion on the shop because of the facility we have there. It doesn't allow us to bring a tractor-trailer unit complete into the shop. So what we're doing is working with tarps, et cetera, through the winter months, and in the rain outside, and in the heat, and using plywood shelters to keep the mechanics out of the sun, et cetera, and on it goes. It is a very, to say the least, primitive setup. We can't do anything about the fact that we have the work at the shop. There's nothing we can do about that. I mean, you can turn people away and we can close. But that's not the game plan. The game plan there was to get to a happy medium, which is where we are with mechanics and trying to keep them, and working in an environment that is totally unreal in some days. I mean, we send guys home because it's too hot or we're in the rain, so we're putting, I made a tarp roof that's on wheels that we can roll around to a job site. It just isn't the way to run a facility, and it looks sloppy to me. Also, speaking on that part, the owner and myself, and I'm a very involved person in this business. I've decided to change my career, and I want to see this thing fly. We're not slobs over there. We're not sloppy. As far as dust control, we grade the yard once a week. We have road graders come in there every 2 months through the summertime because of the equipment to get rid of the potholes, so there isn't water holes, so we don't drag mud up on the road. We put salt brine down. We put stone in whenever there's potholes. The trucks are restricted to 5 kilometers an hour in the yard. If they come in the yard and I catch them, and that's also my job because I'm mostly around the shop, it isn't just a letter in their door. It's walking to the driver and saying, you own this truck, the speed limit in this yard is 5 kilometers. Because the owner, as well as many others, have some very fancy equipment. So when there's somebody piling in there with a truck and kicking up the dust and turning around in a corner, there's no reason for that. And we have eliminated a few that wouldn't listen to the rules. You can't park here anymore. I'm sorry. As far as the buffers are concerned, totally in agreement, as has been the owner of the facility, of putting the buffers in and getting them in and being compliant with the town and also pleasing your neighbors. Sometimes the rules just don't please everybody. But we've never had complaints as long as I've been there of any kind of dust. Of any, there's drivers, there's facilities in different areas where they have no use of Jake brakes. Even that, it is not my issue to stop somebody from using his Jake brake on the highway. But it is when he comes in my yard. And if I hear it and it's an obnoxious noise, the neighbors don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. If I lived there, I wouldn't want to hear that. So that's also something that's approached every time the guy comes in. And there's been guys lectured for that and made to leave. So we're not sitting there, we're just like flunkies running a business and asking the town for something and then we're just going to walk away and not pay attention to anything. That's not how we're trying to do this. We want to get the buffers in. We want the property to look nice for the neighbors, for the community. As far as asphalting the surface is concerned, Ben and myself discussed that. I'm sort of sticking my neck out here a little bit, but I'm going to do it anyways, is asphalting the roadway in where the truck traffic comes in off the highway and exits onto the highway is something that could be done. A laneway, like a 2-way road where the heavy traffic comes in or exits. So if a truck should happen by chance to pick up some mud on the tires in the back, by the time they got to the highway, they wouldn't be dragging this mud on the road, creating a dust. It doesn't really matter. Like you said yourself, if it's asphalted, eventually those trucks turning around there are going to churn it up and there is going to be dust. We have better control, I think, now that it is a stone surface of keeping it smooth and keeping it watered down or salt brine down and restricting the dust. I've seen areas where the yard is asphalted and there's like any kind of a gravel or pothole off to the side gets dragged on the asphalt and now you have dust for a week unless you have a sweeper. So it doesn't make sense, number one, for viability for the heavy units that come in there. They weigh like 140,000 pounds. They would eat that up in like 6 months. It would be destroyed. It really would. A total waste of money as far as the concern of dust control. I'm not going to fight about what is or argue about what hard surface is or is not. I'm just relaying to you what I think to keep the property nice, to keep the neighbors happy. The granite stone that we put down there, which is, I can say for sure there's been at least 30 loads brought in there since I've been there, 3 years. Whenever there's an area that starts to get muddy, it gets spread out, getting the trucks up above the dirt and allowing the water to drain away. And that's basically what causes the mud. If you're churning around in the water all the time, you cause mud. As far as illegal parking, there was mention made of the one neighbor saying there's illegal parking, trucks parking where cars were supposed to be parking. That's not true. There is no parking over there. The north fence from the office space to the highway is all vehicle parking, restricted only to vehicle parking. Trucks are not allowed to park there. To the south of that, facing north as well, it was designated when I got there as an area to park equipment for repairs. So temporary parking. So it could be 20 trailers parked in there, could be none. We made a mistake, that was our fault. We made a mistake to allow one carrier with 3 reefer units to park in that area, designated parking, which faces to the north. We have requested any reefers, and there's only like 5 in our yard. The rest are all flatbed equipment, so there are no motors. Trucks running, I don't know about that, but the reefers we have requested, and we're restricted now because we don't have the space to park anything, to turn the vehicles to the east, which is a field and greenhouses. So if a trailer comes in there and loaded, let's say the reefer is running, cannot be shut off, it gets turned to the east, the noise goes away. I mean, it's way, like it's the other side of the shop. So it would definitely not be an issue with any of the homes along the west side of the property. The entranceway, as far as having security gate, totally agree with that. Because we do have, on occasion, we do have people that come in there, and that's also my job, Mr. Sheriff of Highway 77, to go over and stick a note on his window. You didn't pay to park here, what are you doing here? If I catch the owner, it's a verbal discussion. So it isn't like we just let that fly. Just anybody and everybody comes in there. But we do need the extra facility for parking, and number 2, we do need the shop to be able to expand so that the mechanics we have in a business can actually work like civil people. Thank you.
Okay, I would just like to address back to you. I think you're probably misinterpreting council's intentions up here. I think, and I'm, again, probably just speaking for myself, but having had the conversations with them, that we're not trying to stop you from doing this. We have trusted business people in the past, most of the time with great success, and sometimes not with great success. And it's those issues that we keep trying to make sure are addressed, and you're touching on a lot of those things, and really that's where we're coming from. So, and we know who you are, we know who the gentlemen are running the business, and we do wish you success and want to see this happen. And I think we've kind of indicated that by going back to our planning and engineering department and saying, yeah, hard surfacing the whole thing probably doesn't make a whole lot of economic sense. Is there an alternative? Which I believe you guys suggested in the first place. So I just don't want you to have the wrong opinion of what we're concerned about up here. It really is the residents that live close by that we're most focused on. And you're right, you're never going to make everybody happy no matter how hard you try, but we'll try as hard as we can. And I think that's where we're coming from. So is there anyone else in the audience that wanted to address council on this matter? If not, then I will go back to Councillor Verbeke. Moving the recommendation, supported by Councillor Jacobs. Discussion? Councillor Hammond.
Yeah, thank you. Your Worship, yeah, I think that we have dealt with this, and these owners of this property have dealt with this for a long time, and I think it's time we come to a resolve. I do respect the fact that, the owners at 540, and Danielle, thank you for spending your time with the Fiddlers, because I think that's time well spent where they can address their concerns, and otherwise we maybe wouldn't be aware of some of the problems that you're facing and the ones that you also want to address, Ed. So with that, I'll be voting in favor of passing the motion.
Okay. Any comments, questions? If not, all in favor of the motion? Carried. Thank you. The next public meeting is in regard to drainage, Silver Creek and upper portion, new culvert and assessment. And Ms. Marintet?
Thank you, Mayor. Tonight, we're asking Council to adopt the report provided by NJ Peralta Engineering, dated May 26, 2017, for a new access culvert and revised assessment schedule over the Silver Creek upper part pursuant to Section 78 of the Drainage Act, and that Council authorize the project be tendered, and should the tender be within the engineer's estimate of $60,547, that the Mayor and Clerk be authorized to award the tender and enter into the necessary agreement. Tonight, you will also hear, we're also asking Council for a first and second reading to Bylaw 3917, and that a court of revision be held on the 24th day of July, 2017. Administration received a request from JPI Farms on January 12th to install a new access culvert for their proposed greenhouse development at 430 Mercia Road 7. The property currently has one entrance that is too small and is in the wrong location for their stormwater management pond and their greenhouse development. During the site meeting, I requested that a review of the existing two culverts downstream of the new request be reviewed at the same time, since the existing culverts did not have adequate measures for future maintenance cost sharing. So included in this report is bridge number 1, which serves as a secondary access to the parcel for the new development, and all that cost is 100% assessed to JPI Farms. Bridge number 2 is serving as a first access to parcel 7237, also owned by JPI. No replacement is required at this time. However, the future assessment will be 77% to the bridge owner and 22.5% to the upstream landowners. And then the third is the enclosure, which is the lawn piping servicing the residential lot, which is also owned by JPI. It requires no replacement at this time, but future construction will require that an 18 millimeter pipe replace the existing 1500, and that future assessment will be assessed 54% to the parcel owner, 31% to the parcel upstream, and 14% to the upstream landowners. There is no grant on secondary accesses, only the primary access. We do note that it is, we do have a $5,000 deposit has been received by the owner, and once we have tendered the project and we know what the construction estimate will be, we will ask the landowner for that portion as well. I do apologize this evening that Tony Peralta did have to leave. He had another meeting in Kingsville tonight, a public meeting. So if there is any questions, I'm glad to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions from council? Seeing none, so is there anyone in the audience that wishes to address council on this matter? I see none. Moved by Councilor Verbeke, support by the Deputy Mayor. Discussion on the motion. All in favor? Motion carries. Thank you. So move on to reports of staff and delegations. This evening we have several. So we'll start with the first one regarding the East Marsh drainage scheme. And Mr. Sharon, starting us off.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Patterson. Forgive me for beginning the night in 1973 in this report. However, that's when this issue first began. In 1973, the Township of Mercia hired a drainage engineer to examine parts of the East Marsh drainage scheme. The report was a result of landowners, primarily farmers in the area, requesting that infrastructure be upgraded in the area because the current state was injurious to their lands and to their crops. So the 1973 report that was prepared by William Setterington found that the high lake levels in Lake Erie was causing erosion along the shoreline and flooding the East Marsh drainage scheme. Water was basically overflowing from Lake Erie, overflowing the existing dike along the shoreline and flooding the lands within the scheme. The drainage report identified 3 areas of concern, though we're just here to speak about one tonight. It identified the need for shoreline protection around the scheme, which is the subject of the report, and basically to minimize the effect of erosion along the shoreline of Lake Erie, including the overflowing existing dikes and berms, that Lake Erie shoreline protection be required. The report also spoke to the need for an additional open drain and some works to some drains, as well as some improvements to the First Concession Road dike. The report then determined that for all three phases, the recommended compensation for landowners for damage to crops and lands to construct the works, and it prepared an assessment schedule for the benefiting landowners. The report recommended that the works be kept up and maintained at the expense of the lands and the roads identified in the report at the proportions contained in the schedule of assessment in the report until otherwise determined under the provisions of the Drainage Act. That report was adopted by the Council of Mercia Township, and the works, specifically the works for the shoreline protection, were concluded in and around 1973 and assessed to the benefiting landowners according to the assessment schedule. Now, after speaking with one of the landowners regarding who paid for the works at the time, we were able, since we prepared this report, to go through the files and determine that approximately 80% of the capital costs of the works were funded from upper levels of government through the Agricultural Rehabilitation and Development Act. That's just a little sidebar that wasn't included in the report. So that was in and around 1973. Moving forward to 1999, the Township of Mercia determined that they needed to undertake some maintenance work on the break wall. And before doing that, they realized that the existing assessment schedule wasn't up to date. There are a number of boundary changes and other circumstances that required a new assessment schedule. So under Section 76 of the Act, a new assessment schedule was prepared by Bruce Crozier Engineering. This report basically recommended that the break wall be kept up and maintained based on the existing design and specifications of the 73 report, but recommended a new assessment schedule based on the existing conditions. And that report was adopted by council at that time. So it is important to note, and thanks for putting up the map, Brianna. So we are talking about the break wall along the east side of the map that you see above along Lake Erie. So it's important to note that armor-stone break walls constructed under the Act are considered municipal drainage works, the same as any other drainage works built under the Act. This dike acts as a form of flood protection for the interior lands, basically stopping Lake Erie during storm events from overtopping and flooding those lands. In the fall of 2016, the drainage superintendent became aware of two locations along the break wall which required repair. There was a significant amount of damage to the break wall at two locations at 368 and 342. And so the drainage superintendent determined that the works were severe enough that it warranted emergency repair. Cobby Marine was hired, and they placed 18 loads of armor stone along the break wall and straightened some existing rock as necessary. The cost of that work was approximately $87,000, and that work was billed out to the benefiting landowners based on the assessment schedule prepared in 1999. Once the bills went out recently, some landowners were unhappy with their assessment, and they wished to speak to council about their assessment. And I spoke to the landowners, and we basically agreed that the issue has enough history that it warranted a background staff report prior to the residents coming into council, so that's why this report was prepared. Interestingly enough, going through the file, right now it is the interior landowners that have expressed the greatest concern because of the cost sharing of this works that we were doing. But at the time, it was actually quite the opposite. At the time of constructing, there was 32 different appeals from shoreline residents, cottage owners, basically appealing the work, saying that the primary purpose of the work was to benefit the farmland, and the drainage works building this armor stone dike significantly decreased their enjoyment of their property, the value of the property, the access to the lake, and because it is essentially a 9-foot tall break wall built along the shoreline. Additionally, we certainly recognize, administration recognized the complexity of this matter and the associated costs. And so we would certainly like to take some time to review the file and bring a report back to council, just talking about this particular issue and what our best direction is on a go-forward basis. Because this infrastructure was built under the Drainage Act, it legally compels the municipality to behave a certain way and act a certain way in managing the infrastructure. So, given that this is work prepared under the Act, I did provide in the report just a couple, plausible options as to how this infrastructure will be managed on a go-forward basis. One of them is certainly status quo. It's infrastructure built under the Act with a bylaw and a fairly up-to-date assessment schedule. We could hire a drainage engineer under Section 76 of the Act to look at the existing assessment schedule, very similar to what was done in 1999, and basically tell us if they feel that the assessment schedule is still fair, given what it does. We could also consider hiring an engineer to create a new repair and improvements report under Section 78. And then finally, there's always the option to consider the abandonment of the works under the Drainage Act, though there is certainly a lengthy and comprehensive process to do that. So certainly not here tonight to talk about any of those options specifically, but it's something that we want to look at and bring back in front of council at a later date. One of the things that administration has committed to do is one of the concerns of the landowner is, are we going to see this every year now? Are we going to see a $10,000 bill? $80,000 worth of work every year and just have to pay it because that's what the Drainage Act says. This isn't typical, but again, recognizing the complexity, we're willing to commit to not doing any additional work on the break wall without bringing the matter before council. Again, the municipality is obliged to act in a certain way under the Act. But before we act similar to what we did in the fall and address these emergency concerns, we will write a brief report on the issue, bring it back in front of council, and frankly, seek direction from council if council feels that that's appropriate. And so the recommendation before council tonight is that the report be received for information.
Thank you very much. Just two quick questions. Is the entire East Beach break wall part of this drainage scheme then?
Yes, if we can see on the map, the blue dotted line represents the works that are covered under the scheme.
So back in the day when that was constructed, you say 80% was funded by the feds and the province. That's the funding we've tried to go back for a few times with minister meetings at conferences, and they keep saying they're not interested in getting into shoreline protection again.
Yes.
With the higher lake levels that all of us are suffering from now, not just Lake Erie, would it be worthwhile to be pestering them again, or?
Yes, excuse me, Passion. I think it's certainly appropriate to continue to have those conversations with upper levels of government. They have their funding programs that they have in place now. But, recognizing the challenges that we face in all of Southeast Leamington with regards to the sustainability of the infrastructure, it's certainly something that we'll continue to advocate for.
And the other one was if we abandon that. I always assumed that most of that was just private property and their own break walls they had to look after. But if we abandon it as part of the drainage scheme, what happens then?
If the municipality were successful in going through the process, because it is a comprehensive process and the landowners who benefit from it certainly have a say, and it would likely end up in the courts would be my guess. But if the municipality were successful in abandoning the works, then the scheme essentially would be at the mercy of the shoreline landowners to maintain that infrastructure. Again, in going through the file and actually read all of the submissions of the 32 individuals who submitted, just to try and get an appreciation as to the state in 1973. Some of the properties didn't have any shoreline protection whatsoever. Some had armor stone, but very little. And the municipality in the scheme, the landowners within the scheme felt that building this break wall under the Act was the only way to sort of take control of that shoreline and ensure that basically they could keep Lake Erie out and avoid the flooding that they were experiencing in 1973.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Verbicki.
Really, Mayor, if I can ask a question, maybe probably Luann of the Drainage Act. Let's say I have a bridge that goes out and I want it replaced. I have to pay 50%. Does this not fall underneath the Drainage Act also, that if somebody makes a complaint and has a problem, that they pay the 50% and then the abutting landowners or benefiting landowners would pay the rest?
through Mayor Patterson, not for maintenance on this break wall, Counselor. There's an established maintenance schedule for this break wall, and it determines how maintenance works are built out.
That's why you put the word protection after it?
Councillor Hammond?
Your worship, thank you. Rob, in going through this report over the weekend, I looked up the water lake levels over the last number of years. In 1973, I don't even think it was the highest. And maybe this question I'm going to ask is better asked of Tom, and I see some others out in the audience who own a lot of property down in the marsh. But at what point are these break walls not going to be able to hold back the lake? I mean, the lake right today is only 6 inches lower than its maximum height ever. And we know it's going to, and it's gone up a foot since last year. Question number one. Question number two of you, Rob, is that it's my understanding that some of the property owners along East Beach have taken parts of this wall down to get a better vantage view of the lake. True?
Yes, I do note that in the report, that some of the landowners did that exact thing. So over some period of time between 1973 when it was built and 1999 when the last assessment schedule was done, it was noted in the 1999 assessment schedule that has happened. Great big tall break wall in front of the cottage properties or in front of the lakefront homes, and the owners at the time, without permission, knocked down the walls or moved the walls, and some of them pushed it out to make a point and try and reclaim more of the beach. So that has happened. Certainly it's if we were made aware of that happening today, we would act on it. But it's very difficult now, going back historically, if it happened 20 years ago, to determine, who did it and how it was done. Our options would include going in there and actually building it back up again. How we assess the cost of doing that would be a challenge. It would likely be charged back to the scheme.
Councillor Dunn?
Through your worship, sorry, I guess it wasn't on. Rob, I drove East Beach, and there is actually one particular property that just like it was sand. I didn't see any armstone out there. In building up this wall, that obviously wasn't a concerned property?
Through you, Mayor Patterson, Councillor, forgive me, but I'm not sure of the property that you're speaking of. Again, I do know that there are some properties who took the armor stone out. I can't sit here and pretend like I'm an expert on the state of it or I know every single piece of it along. I just don't. I know legally what was done under the Drainage Act and the processes that we're supposed to follow, and sort of what we're compelled to do, and the reason the Drainage Superintendent act the way she did in basically maintaining drainage infrastructure under the Act. To suggest we shouldn't repair it because it wasn't repaired in previous situations, it's kind of a fallacy of logic, right? We shouldn't, we shouldn't do that. If we're made aware of issues and the property owners within the scheme are requesting that we maintain it, we have an obligation to look at it. Again, I think, given what we know about the project now, we'll have a little bit more in-depth conversation, and we do want to look at big picture, long-term, how are we maintaining this infrastructure and what are our options? But I do know, Councillor, in speaking with the Drainage Superintendent, that there are properties where there's no armor stone now at all, or it's been significantly altered.
Councillor Jacobs?
Thank you, Worship. Rob, just for clarification purposes and for my behalf anyway, the assessment schedule that we have here in front of us tonight, now, you mentioned earlier, is it 73, 99, 2017? What is this assessment based on? And is it just speculative now that will be corrected after, or?
No, Councillor, this work was built out based on the 1999 assessment schedule. That's the most up-to-date assessment schedule we have on the file. So when Mercia Township was doing works in the late 1990 on the break wall, it was at that time that they said over the last 25 plus years it's changed down here and we need a new assessment schedule. We are relying on the 1999 assessment schedule because it's fairly accurate, at least insofar as how the property boundaries and severances and go.
If I may? Thank you, Worship. So then currently, this assessment would stand for the property owners involved, correct? That this is the final note here?
Yes, one of the things we plan to do is to sit with a drainage engineer and just talk about this file, and say, given the previous assessment schedule that was done in 1999, take a look at it. It's law. It was a bylaw. It was accepted and passed. It went through the process. But if there's something